Alrighty. Hello, welcome back. Part 4 of Pride and Prejudice and Zombies. We just left everyone still at the Mr. Bingley's manor and place, and his family don't really seem too keen on Elizabeth, nor the fact that Jane is staying around, but they also seem like ugly stepsisters that are just hating, so... They just agreed. Mr. Bingley just agreed to, what was it, Lydia? Or who was it that said it? Yeah, it was Lydia, the youngest sister, 15. She was like, oh, you should throw a party because you said you would. And he's like, I certainly will. And so then, yeah. But remember the last party we went to? Lots of zombies. So we'll see what happens. Let's just get into it then, all right? Chapter 10. The day passed much as the day before had done. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley had spent some hours of the morning with the invalid, who continued though slowly, to mend, and in the evening Elizabeth joined their party in the drawing room. The card table, however, did not appear. Mr. Darcy was writing, and Miss Bingley, seated near him, was watching the progress of his letter and repeatedly calling off his attention by messages to his sister. Mr. Hurst and Mr. Bingley were at piquet, and Mrs. Hurst was observing their game. Anybody play piquet out there? I've never heard it. Maybe it's like croquet. Elizabeth took up the oiling of her musket stock and was sufficiently amused in attending to what passed between Darcy and his companion. How delighted Miss Darcy will be to receive such a letter. He made no answer. You write very uncommonly fast, and you prattle uncommonly much. How many letters you must have occasion to write in the course of a year? Letters of business, too. How odious I should think of them, and how odious indeed that I should so often suffer to write them in your company. Pray tell your sister that I long to see her. I already told her so once by your desire. How can you contrive to write so even? He was silent. Tell your sister I am delighted to hear of her improvement on the harp, and pray let her know that I am quite in raptures with her beautiful little design for a table. Miss Bingley, the groans of 100 unmentionables would be more pleasing to my ears than one more word from your mouth. Were you not otherwise agreeable, I should be forced to remove your tongue with my sabre. Oh, it is of no consequence. I shall see her in January. But do you always write with such charming long letters to her, Mr. Darcy? They are generally long, but whether always charming, it is not for me to determine. It is a rule with me that the person who can write a long letter with ease cannot write ill. That will not do for a compliment to Darcy, Caroline, cried her brother, because he does not write with ease. He studies too much for words of 4 syllables. Do you not, Darcy? Mr. Darcy continued to work on his letter in silence, though Elizabeth perceived him to be a great deal annoyed with his friends. When that business was over, Mr. Darcy applied to Miss Bingley and Elizabeth for an indulgence of some music. Miss Bingley, moved with some alacrity, Alacrity, I don't know, never read it, to the pianoforte, and after a polite request that Elizabeth would lead their way, she seated herself. Mrs. Hurst sang with her sister as Elizabeth played. Once one the earth was still and dead were silent, and London town was for but living men. Come the plague upon us swift and violent, and so our dearest England was defend. While they were thus employed, Elizabeth could not help observing how frequently Mr. Darcy's eyes were fixed on her. She hardly knew how to suppose that she could be an object of admiration to so great a man, and yet that he should look at her because he disliked her was still more strange. She could only imagine, however, that she drew his notice because there was something more wrong and irreprehensible, according to his ideas of right, than in other person present. The superstition did not pain her. She liked him too little to care for his approbation. Miss Bingley played next, very charming, varying the charm by a lively Scotch air, and soon afterwards Mr. Darcy, drawing Elizabeth near, said to her, Do you not feel great inclination, Miss Bennet, to seize such an opportunity of dancing a reel? She smiled, but made no answer. He repeated the question with some surprise at her silence. Oh, she said, I heard you before, but I could not immediately determine what to say in reply. You wanted me, I know, to say yes, that you might have the pleasure of despising my taste. but I always delight in overthrowing those kind of schemes, and cheating a person of their premeditated contempt. I have, therefore, made up my mind to tell you that I do not want to dance a reel at all, and now despise me if you dare." "Indeed I do not dare." Elizabeth, having rather expected to affront him, was amazed at his gallantry, and Darcy had never been so bewitched by any woman as was by her. He really believed that were it not for the inferiority of her connections, he should be in some danger of falling in love, and were it not for his considerable skill in the deadly arts, that he should be in danger of being bested by hers, for never had he seen a lady more gifted in the ways of vanquishing the undead. Miss Bingley saw, or suspected enough to be jealous, and her great anxiety for recovery of her dear friend Jane received some assistance from her desire of getting rid of Elizabeth. She often tried to provoke Darcy into disliking her guest by talking of supposed marriage and planning his happiness in such an alliance. "I hope," said she, as they were walking together in the shrubbery the next day, "you will give your mother-in-law a few hints when this desirable event takes place as to the advantage of holding her tongue, and if you can compass it, do cure the younger girls of running after officers, and, if I may mention so delicate a subject, endeavour to check Miss Bennet's unladylike affinity for guns and swords and exercise and all those silly things best left to men or ladies of low breeding." A little mention about the officers. If you don't remember, they sent in some soldiers to deal with the dead. That's about it. And the girls are like, "Oh my God, soldier boy, man in uniform." I know. Have you anything else to propose for my domestic felicity? At the moment they were met from another walk by Mrs. Hurst and Elizabeth herself. I did not know that you intended to walk," said Miss Bingley, in some confusion, lest she had been overheard. You used us abominably ill," answered Mrs. Hurst, "running away without telling us that you were coming out." Then, taking the disengaged arm of Mr. Darcy, she left Elizabeth to walk by herself. The path just admitted 3. Mr. Darcy felt their rudeness, and immediately said, "This walk is not wide enough for our party. We had better go in the avenue." But Elizabeth, who had not the least inclination to remain with them, laughingly answered, No, stay where you are. You are charmingly grouped, and appear to uncommon advantage. The picturesque would be spoilt by admitting a 4th. Besides, that path is most assuredly rife with zombies, and I have not the inclination to engage in fighting them off today. Goodbye." She then ran gaily off, rejoicing as she rambled about in the hope of being home again in a day or 2. Jane was already so much recovered as to intend leaving her room for a couple hours that evening. Well, lovely. Chapter 11. When the ladies were moved after dinner, Elizabeth ran up to her sister, and seeing her well, attended her to the drawing-room, where she was welcomed by Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst with many professions of pleasure. Elizabeth had never seen them so agreeable as they were during the hour which passed before the gentleman appeared. Despite their lack of fighting skills, she had to admit that their powers of conversation were considerable. If only words were capable of beheading If only words were capable of beheading a zombie, she thought, I would presently find myself in the company of the world's greatest warriors. The world's 2 greatest warriors. Not 2 worlds, there's 1 world. But when the gentleman entered, Miss Bingley's eyes were instantly turned towards Darcy, and she had something to say to him before he had advanced many steps. He addressed himself to Jane with polite congratulation. Mr. Hurst also made a slight bow, and said he was very glad indeed that it had been but a cold, and not the strange plague. But the greatest warmth remained for Bingley's salutation. He was full of joy and attention. The first half-hour was spent in piling up the fire, lest she should suffer from the change of room. He then sat down by her and talked scarcely to anyone else. That's so cute. Elizabeth took to the small grinding wheel in the corner of the room and watched it all with great delight whilst sharpening a gentleman's sword, which she had found embarrassingly dull upon examination. When tea was over, Mr. Hurst reminded his sister-in-law of the card-table, but in vain. She had obtained private intelligence that Mr. Darcy did not wish for cards, and Mr. Hurst soon found his open petition rejected. She assured him that no one intended to play, and the silence of the whole party on the subject seemed to justify her. Mr. Hurst had therefore nothing to do but to stretch himself on the sofas and go to sleep. Darcy took up a book, Miss Bingley did the same, and Mrs. Hurst, principally occupied in playing with one of Elizabeth's throwing stars, joined now and then in brother's conversation with Miss Bennet. I love that she has throwing stars. That's pretty funny. That's like, she just has like I picture like a target, you know, in the hall where the piano is, the grand piano, and they're just like, you know, yeah. Joined in now and broad conversation. Okay. Miss Bingley's attention was quite as much engaged in watching Mr. Darcy's progress through his book, as in reading her own, and she was perpetually either making some inquiry or looking at his page. She could not win him, however, to any conversation. He merely answered a question and read on. At length, quite exhausted by the attempt to be amused with her own book, which she had only chosen because it was the second volume of his, she gave a great yawn and said, "How pleasant it is to spend an evening in this way. I declare, after all, there is no enjoyment like reading." "Spoken like one who has never known the ecstasy of holding a still beating heart in her hand," said Darcy. Wow. Miss Bingley, who was quite used to having her lack of combat training impugned, made no reply. She then yawned, threw aside her book, and cast her eyes around the room in quest for some amusement. When hearing her brother mentioning a ball to Miss Bennet, she turned suddenly towards him and said, "By the by, Charles, are you really serious in meditating a dance at Netherfield? I would advise you to consult the wishes of the present party, and I am much mistaken if there are not some among us to whom a ball would be rather a punishment than a pleasure." Or whatever, party pooper. Don't care about you. If you mean Darcy, cried her brother, he may go to bed if he chooses before it begins. But as for the ball, it is quite a settled thing, and as soon as the ground has sufficiently hardened and the present increased and unmentionables has passed, I shall send round my cards. I should like balls infinitely better, she replied, if they were carried on in a different manner. You shall like balls infinitely better, said Darcy, if you knew the first thing about them. Oh. Elizabeth blushed and suppressed a smile, slightly shocked by his flirtation with impropriety, and slightly impressed that he should endeavour to flirt with it at all. Miss Bingley, ignorant of his meaning, made no answer, and soon after she got up and walked around the room. Her figure was elegant, and she walked well, but Darcy, at whom it was all aimed, was inflexibly studious. In the desperation of her feelings, she resolved on one more effort, and turning to Elizabeth, said, "Miss Eliza Bennet, let me persuade you to follow my example, and take turn about the room. I assure you it is very refreshing after sitting so long in one attitude." Elizabeth needed no such refreshment. She had once been ordered to maintain a handstand for 6 days in the blistering Beijing sun, but agreed to it immediately. Miss Bingley succeeded no less in the real object of her civility. Mr. Darcy looked up and unconsciously closed his book. He was directly invited to join the party, but he declined it, of course, observing that he could imagine but two motives for their choosing to walk up and down the room together, each of which his joining them would upset. What could he mean? She was dying to know what he could be meaning, and asked Elizabeth whether she could be at all understand him. "Not at all," was her answer, "but depending upon it, he might be severe on us, and our surest way of disappointing him will be to ask nothing about it." It's just like, don't talk to him, don't show him you like him. Play hard to get. I love it. Miss Bingley, however, was incapable of such self-discipline, and preserved therefore in requiring an explanation of his two motives. So I just need to take a drink. I have not the smallest objection to explain them, said he. You either choose this method of passing this evening because you are incapable of sitting quietly, or because you are conscious that your figures appear to the greatest advantage in walking. In first, you are but silly girls, undeserving of my attention, and, if the second, I can admire you much better far from here. In fact, the glowing of the fire casts quite a revealing silhouette against the fabric of your gowns. "Oh, shocking!" cried Miss Bingley, stepping away from the fireplace. "I've never heard anything so abominable. How shall we punish him for such a speech?" "I have several ideas on the subject," said Elizabeth, "but I'm afraid none would meet the approval of the present party." "Have you no insight into his weaknesses? You and he being so intimately acquainted?" "Upon my honour, I do not. I do assure you that my intimacy has not yet taught me that. Mr. Darcy possesses calmness of manner, presence of mind, and bravery in battle. Yes, but does he also possess vanity and pride? Yes, vanity is a weakness indeed, said Miss Bingley, but pride, well, where there is a real superiority of mind, pride will always be under good regulation. Elizabeth turned away to hide a smile. Your examination of Mr. Darcy is over, I presume, said Miss Bingley. And pray, what is the result? I am perfectly convinced by it that Mr. Darcy has no defect. No, said Darcy, I have faults enough, but they are not, I hope, of understanding. My temper I dare not vouch for. I have taken many a life for offences which would seem but trifles to other men. I challenge you to a duel. That is a failing indeed, cried Elizabeth, but you have chosen your fault well, for it is one which I share. I, too, live by the warrior code, and would gladly kill if my honour demanded it. You are safe from me. There is, I believe, in every disposition a tendency to some particular evil, a natural defect, which not even the best education can overcome. And your defect, Mr. Darcy, is to hate everybody, and yours, he replied with a smile, is wilfully to misunderstand them. Do let us have a little music, cried Miss Bingley, tired of conversation in which she had no share. Louisa, will you not mind my walking Mr. Hurst? Her sister had not the smallest objection, and the pianoforte was opened. In waking, not walking. Waking Mr. Hurst. That makes more sense. Her sister had not the smallest objection, and the pianoforte was opened, and Darcy was not sorry for it. He began to feel the danger of paying Elizabeth too much attention. Chapter 12. How's it going? Alright. Chapter 12. What are we going to get across? Is there any, I'm waiting for the zombies still. I like the zombie parts. Alrighty. I'm sure it'll come. Chapter 12. In consequence of an argument between the sisters, Elizabeth wrote the next morning to their mother to beg that the carriage might be sent for them in the course of the day. But Mrs. Bennet, who had calculated on her daughter's remaining at Netherfield till the following Tuesday, which would exactly finish James's week, could not bring herself to receive them with pleasure before. Her answer, therefore, was disappointing. Mrs. Bennet sent them word that they could not possibly have the carriage before Tuesday, for it had been badly damaged by errant musket balls during a skirmish between soldiers and a party of the Surrey stricken near the encampment at Meryton. This was at least particularly true, for the carriage had indeed been caught in a crossfire when Catherine and Lydia used it to visit with a group of officers, but the damage was in fact less severe than Miss Bennet suggested. In her postscript, it was added that if Mr. Bingley and his sisters pressed them to stay longer, she could spare them. Against staying longer, however, Elizabeth urged Jane to borrow Mr. Bingley's carriage immediately, and at length it was settled that their original design of leaving Netherfield that morning should be mentioned and the request made. The request excited many professions of concern, and enough was said of wishing them to stay at least till the following day to allow the ground to further harden, and till the morrow their going was deferred. Miss Bingley was then sorry that she had proposed for the delay, for her jealousy and dislike of Elizabeth much exceeded her affection for Jane. Mr. Bingley heard with real sorrow that they were going to go so soon, and repeatedly tried to persuade Miss Bennet that it would not be safe for her, that she was not enough recovered to fight if the carriage should meet with trouble. But Jane reminded him that Elizabeth was as capable a bodyguard as there was in all of England. To Mr. Darcy, it was welcome intelligence. Elizabeth had been at Netherfield long enough. She attracted him more than he liked, and Miss Bingley was uncivil to her, and more teasing than usual to himself. He resolved that no sign of admiration should now escape him. Steady to his purpose, he scarcely spoke 10 words to her through the whole of the Saturday, and though they were at one time left by themselves for half an hour, he adhered most conscientiously to his book, and would not even look at her. On Sunday after morning service, the separation took place. Miss Bingley's civility to Elizabeth increased at least very rapidly, and as well her affection for Jane, and when they parted, after assuring that the latter of the pleasure it would always give her to see either... Okay, let's start over. as well as her affection for Jane, and when they parted, after assuring the latter of the pleasure it would always give her to see either at Longbourn or Netherfield, and embracing her most tenderly, she even shook hands with the former. Elizabeth took leave of the whole party in the liveliest of spirits. She's like, I'm ready to get the fuck out of here. To ride the Longbourn was altogether agreeable, save for a brief encounter with a small herd of zombie children, no doubt from Mrs. Beecham's home of orphans, which had recently fallen along with the entire parish of St. Thomas's. Oh my god, zombie kids. Oh my, I wish we had a picture of that. That's funny. Mr. Bingley's coachman could not help but vomit down the front of his cravat at the sight of the tiny devils grazing on the sun-hardened corpses in a nearby field. Elizabeth kept her musket close lest they advance, but luck was on their side, and the cursed children took no notice of the carriage. That's so funny. All right. They were not welcomed home very cordially by their mother, and Mrs. Bennet thought them very wrong to give so much trouble. Look at the reflection of my glasses. Let's take that off. Maybe we have less of them. Thought them very wrong to give so much trouble, and was sure Jane would have caught cold again. Her protests were inflamed by the sight of vomit on the coachman's cravat, a sure sign that they had encountered unmentionables en route. But their father was truly glad to see them, for the evening sparring sessions had lost much of their animation by the absence of Jane and Elizabeth. They found Mary, as usual, deep in the study of human nature. Catherine and Lydia had information for them of a different sort. Much had been done, and much had been said in the regiment since the preceding Wednesday. Several of the officers had dined lately with their uncle. A private had been flogged for engaging in base acts with the headless corpse, and it might actually be hinted that Colonel Forster was going to be married. Well. Lots of information happening, lots of gossip around the city. Ooh la la. All right, one more chapter, I think, for this one. Chapter 13. Ooh, the spookiest chapter. Chapter 13. I hope it's good luck. I hope, my dear, said Mr. Bennet to his wife, as they were at breakfast the next morning, that you have ordered a good dinner today, because I have no reason to expect an addition to our family party. What do you mean, my dear? I know of nobody that is coming, I'm sure, unless Charlotte Lucas should happen to call in. And I am sure my dinners are good enough for her, since she is an unmarried woman of 27, and such should expect little more than a crust of bread washed down with a cup of loneliness. Oh my god, savage. The person whom I speak of is a gentleman and a stranger. Mrs. Bennet's eyes sparkled. A gentleman and a stranger? It is Mr. Bingley, I am sure. I shall be extremely glad to see Mr. Bingley. But good Lord, how unlucky. There's not a bit of fish to be got today. Lydia, my love, ring the bell. I must speak to Hill at this moment. It is not Mr. Bingley, you senseless old cur, said her husband. It is a person whom I never saw in the whole course of my life. After amusing himself some time with their curiosity, he thus explained. About a month ago I received this letter, and about a fortnight ago I answered it. It is from my cousin, Mr. Collins, who, when I am dead, may turn you all out of this house as soon as he pleases. Oh, my dear, cried his wife, pray do not talk of that odious man. I do not think of the hottest thing in the world that your estate should be entailed away from your own children. Jane and Elizabeth tried to explain that all 5 of them were capable of fending for themselves, that they could make tolerable fortunes as bodyguards, assassins, or mercenaries if needed. But it was a subject on which Mrs. Bennet was beyond the reach of reason, and she continued to rail bitterly against the cruelty of settling an estate away from a family of 5 daughters, in favor of a man whom nobody cared anything about. Fair. It is certainly in a most inquitous affair, said Mr. Bennet. Oh, it is certainly a most inquitous affair, said Mr. Bennet, and nothing can clear Mr. Collins from the guilt of inheriting Longbourn. But, if you will listen to this letter, you may perhaps be a little softened by his manner of expressing himself. Hunsford, near Westersham, Kent, 15th of October. Oh, dang, that was like yesterday. Look at that. Dope. Dear Sir, the disagreement subsisting between yourself and my late honored father always gave me much uneasiness. He was a great warrior, as you once were, and I know he looked with fondness upon the days when you both fought side by side, back when the strange plague was but an isolated inconvenience. Since his passing, I have frequently wished to heal the breach, but for some time I was kept back by my own doubts, fearing lest it might seem disrespectful to his memory for me to be on good terms with anyone with whom my father had once vowed to castrate. My mind, however, is now made up on the subject, for having entered the priesthood, I have been so fortunate as to be distinguished by the patronage at the Right Honourable Lady Catherine de Bourges. Heavens, cried Elizabeth, he works for Lady Catherine? Let me finish, said Mr. Bennet sternly. Whose skill with blade and musket are unmatched, and who has slain more unmentionables than any woman known. Oh, that's why she loves her. That's funny. I was like, why would she like, the priestess? It doesn't seem like Elizabeth. Nah, she's just a badass bitch who kills a lot of zombies. Hell yeah. As a clergyman, I feel it my duty to promote and establish the blessing of peace in all families. If you should have no objection to receive me into your house, I propose myself the satisfaction of waiting on you and your family, Monday, November 18th, by 4 o'clock, and shall probably trespass on your hospitality till the Saturday following. I remain, dear sir, with respectful compliments to your ladies and daughters, your well-wisher and friend, William Collins. At 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman. Oh, at 4 o'clock, therefore, we may expect this peacemaking gentleman. Oh, so it's already November 18th. Okay, so that's the timeline in this book. November 18th, today. It's going to be 4 o'clock soon. So Mr. Bennet, as he folded up the letter, he seems to be a most conscientious and polite young man, and I doubt not will prove a valuable acquaintance, especially in light of his association with Lady Catherine. Mr. Collins was punctual to his time and received with great politeness by the whole family. Mr. Bennet indeed said little, but the ladies were ready enough to talk, and Mr. Collins seemed neither in need of encouragement nor inclined to be silent himself. He was a short, fat young man of 25. His air was grave and stately, and his manners were very formal. He had not yet been long seated before he complimented Mrs. Bennet on having so fine a family of daughters, and said that he had heard much of their beauty, but that in this instance fame had fallen short of the truth, and added that he could hardly wait to see a display of their legendary fighting skill. You are very kind, I am sure, but I should rather see them with husbands than muskets, for else they will be destitute enough. Things are settled so oddly. You allude, perhaps, to the entail of this estate? Ah, sir, I do indeed. It is a grievous affair to my poor girls, you must confess. I am very sensible, madame, of the hardship to my fair cousins, and could say on much of the subject, but that I am cautious of appearing forward and precipitate. But I can assure you, the young ladies, that I come prepared to admire them. At present, I will not say more, but perhaps when we are better acquainted. He was interrupted by a summons to a dinner, and the girls smiled on each other. They were not the only objects of Mr. Collins' admiration. The hall, the dining room, and all its furniture were examined and praised, and his commendation of everything would have touched Mrs. Bennet's heart, but for the mortifying supposition of his viewing it all as his own future property. Yeah, it's like nice furniture, nice couch, can't wait to have it. Ooh. The dinner was too highly admired, and he begged to know to which of his fair cousins the excellency of his cookery was owing. Briefly forgetting her manners, Mary grabbed her fork and leapt from her chair onto the table. Lydia, who was seated nearest her, grabbed her ankle before she could dive at Mr. Collins and, presumably, stab him about the head and neck for such an insult. Jane and Elizabeth turned away so Mr. Collins would not see them laughing. Why is that an insult? Could not see them laughing. Oh well, whatever. He was set right by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with some asperity that they were very well able to keep a good cook, and that her daughters were too busy training to be bothered at the kitchen. Oh, I see. It's like, how dare you think we cooked it when we can just hire people to cook it for us? How dare you? We're too busy fighting. We're not cooking women. That's fair, I guess. Okay. I thought maybe he was just saying nice things about the food. Oh. Anyways, we're almost at the end. All right. He was set right by Mrs. Bennet, who assured him with some asperity that they were very well able to keep a good cook, and that her daughters were too busy training to be bothered with the kitchen. He begged pardon for having displeased Mary, and in a softened tone she declared herself not at all offended, but he continued to apologize for about a quarter of an hour. And that brings us to chapter 14. Still nothing too new going on. Just more dinners and talks, There were zombie children this time. That was funny. I like that. That was a good little detail. Zombie children. Yeah, we got a new guy, Mr. Collins, who's the cousin of Mr. Bennett. So, yeah, we'll see. We'll see what happens in chapter 14. Anyways, thank you so much. Until next time, spooky people.